This is the Peace Meals second presentation on the how of Peace Meals. I'm your host, Ben Wayman. Not really. Ben and I keep getting mistaken for one another. Ben got thanked for such a great job he did with Charles yesterday. And like a trooper, he just said, "Thank you. Oh, it was my pleasure." Got a little awkward when Ben's wife, Michelle, came up to me and said, "Why didn't you pay the water bill this month?" And so I just played along too. I was like, "I know, I'm an awful husband. I'm also a really bad father." And she agreed. All right. The more jokes I tell, the more people leave. This is like church. This is like the Alton mission right now, actually. It really is. Okay. Well, I think that we have safely whittled it down to the people who are staying. Excellent. So this, especially since we have so few folks, excellent. Guessing since we covered the why yesterday, that you all may be folks that you're kind of on that same page with the why, and so now you're most interested in, okay, how did you actually get to the place where you're running these groups? And so since some of that agreement is already in the room, we're going to review a couple of those things just so I know we have them in mind, but this can also be more of a discussion, especially since there's so few of us in the room, okay? So if you have questions or thoughts, would love for you to raise your hand and this be kind of more of a discussion. I have sort of a general outline that I hope to be able to read as we go through it. Peace Meals, as you probably saw in the brochure, is designed to be an experience in interpersonal reconciliation. This experience consists of 8 to 10 people from racially diverse backgrounds getting together for a series of 4 meals. And then we created a discussion guide that travels kind of an arc, a narrative arc. So we didn't want to just go, okay, we just assume if everybody gets together in the same place and they're willing to talk to each other, that something will just happen, that somehow reconciliation is just being able to have dinner without a food fight breaking out. Having something like that. But honestly, a lot of times, especially in white communities, the fact that there's not outright hostility is evidence enough for us sometimes that everything is fine. And so there really are sort of temptations and tendencies and blind spots, especially for a white person entering into this, that really we tried to carefully design the experience. So some of those ways in which white folks tend to short circuit what's going on maybe don't happen quite so easily. So I want to go over that, because when you hear that there are 6 or 7 of these piecemeal groups going in Alton. So Alton Mission is a church of 30 people come, or sometimes it's 40, sometimes it's 45. It's not a huge church, but in terms of the number of people who are involved in the peace meals, there are about 60 to 70 people from across the community. And so it's not quite as simple as we're going to do this. We're going to put a brochure in the lobby. We don't really have a lobby because we just rent the YWCA. So it's a different way of getting it. So in some ways you kind of go, okay, 60 to 70 people involved in a small group ministry, and we translate it because we want the numbers, and we already have a space sort of cognitively or programmatically for the kind of thing that we think this is. We say, yeah, I also want my small group experience or my small group ministry to grow or include other people from the community, and that's kind of a backwards way of getting there. Or if I told you that in order to launch the peace meals and invite people to be a part of it, we had a community feast where 250 plus people showed up together in the same space to just share a meal, then you might go, well, that sounds like a lot of visibility, and visibility is a good thing in itself, and that sounds like a crowd of people, and a crowd of people is a good thing in itself. And so we value these things in themselves, and we go, well, I also would like to gather 250 people together. But the whole idea that I want to get to today is it's got to be the commitment to the real work that gets us to a place eventually where that begins to have an impact and to transform a community. And that really, in some ways, you've got to give up the idea of it working to grow numbers and influence for your church. Charles, and after yesterday's session, this may not be a surprise to you, Charles has had more people visit his church because of the piecemeal experience than I've had people visit my church. This is not a Sunday morning attendance building strategy. I just want you to hear that, because I know that one of our goals that we've been asked to create for each church is to have a target for growth in Sunday morning attendance. And this is probably the most inefficient way to do that. We've had people leave. We have not really had people come. I think that we've had people from the community join us because the heart for reconciliation is a part of who we are as a church, but they haven't joined us through any kind of programmatic outreach or anything like that, okay? So let's check in on the why one more time, because if we don't know what the problem is, then we're never going to be able to diagnose it properly. We're never going to be able to find the right solution. So let's go just back through what is racism. So reminders of what we heard yesterday. Key features of a definition of racism would include what? Power, right? Prejudice plus power. Good. Okay. Yeah, so it spans the spectrum from ignorance and blind spots to outright hostility. But all of that is a spectrum that would be there, that racism includes, which is important because there are some very well-meaning people who do some very racist things. And, I mean, as white folks, what would we prefer to be the definition of racism? We'd prefer it to be a sheet over your head, outright hostility and bias toward other people, actively and working with intent to harm people whose skin color is different from mine. And so you set the bar there, and you go, well, as long as I'm not there, then I'm not a racist. Which also means what we have to contend with, I have to contend with this in my heart, even coming and doing a presentation like this, because the temptation is, and the pressure inside of white folks often is to get off the hook for racism. And so even for me, there's a temptation to say, okay, if I'm the one presenting about reconciliation and racism, then that's got to be my get out of racism free card. That's got to be the thing that I can point to, that now I can know and take a deep breath that I'm not racist, and now it's also been sort of verified with other people. The tendency to do that as white folks is so strong and so automatic, right? So yes, the ignorance is a part of it. That's where we talked about yesterday, not only intent, but also impact. We're on the hook for the impact of our words, of our actions, of our systems, right? Other features of a definition of racism that you heard from yesterday, or that you would add today.
How about insecurity?
Insecurity? Okay. Tell me just a little more about that.
Well, a person from any part of the human spectrum can be insecure in themselves and have a need to feel better, dominate.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, insecurity, fear can drive a lot of it. I think there's a fear of, and maybe we'll just do this now. I think that they're a part of what I feel inside of me in not wanting to own up to things that I've done that have been racially harmful, not wanting to own up to blind spots that are harmful. Comments that I make is I'm afraid that burden of racism is too great for me to bear. I'm afraid that being guilty of that is too much of kind of this categorical, global, like you are now this kind of a person. And so the fear and insecurity activates that fight, flight, or freeze in our brains. And so we can't just go, you know what, I have racial bias. I do. And not only that, I act out of racial bias. Now, this is this is in part the way that our brains work, okay? So your perceiving, automatic, unconscious brain that's constantly scanning your environment to make sure that you're safe, see what's around you, what are the threats, what are the opportunities. This part of your brain processes a ton of information and has certain identifiable shortcuts to be able to deliver up to your more conscious, more thinking, your not more thinking, but your slower thinking. Because it's a kind of thinking, it's a kind of processing, but it happens so quickly, and it takes recognizable shortcuts that it delivers some interpretations. Right? It gives a little packet of information to your slower thinking brain that kind of decides what are we going to do with this information. So one way to think about this is, and if I were more prepared as a presenter, I would have made a slide for this. But if you could do this on your paper, but just think through it, and I think you'll know what it is. If you make two lines that are exactly the same length, use a ruler, make it 3 inches long, whatever. Now, if that line, you put like kind of an arrow on each side pointing out, and then on the other line, have those arrows pointing in, attached to the line. So on the ends of the line, you're going to have arrows pointing out on one end, on one line, and then arrows pointing in on the other. Now, even though you make those lines exactly the same size, the way in which your perception works is when those arrows on the outside of the line are pointing in, your brain interprets that line as longer than the one where the arrows are pointing out. All right, you'd have to kind of do this to sort of see. Now, if I put those two lines up there and I said, which of these two lines is longer? Everyone in here, because of the way your perception works, your perceiving brain would deliver to you the one line is longer. Now, the slower thinking, let's make a rational decision brain would probably see this and go, this seems like a setup, right? And you would say, okay, I know that one seems longer, but this seems like a really silly thing, so there must be something else going on. Now, what happens is when you know that your perceptual framework makes this mistake, then you can say, I've seen this before. So I know this is a trick. I know these two lines are actually the same. But that doesn't mean you can change what your perceiving brain delivers to your slower thinking brain. Okay? Now, in some ways, what I want to suggest is that bias, racial bias, works this same way. And oftentimes we're trying to explain ourselves out of the thinking brain that knows that two things are equal, and denying the sort of perceiving, faster thinking brain that scans the room for threats and opportunities and is delivering to us biased results. Now, those biases, a little bit different from kind of the perceiving visually, those biases can change over time, but that also means those biases can be strengthened rather than weakened. So those biases can be strengthened especially through trauma. So there are some folks that they can know that two people are equal. But because maybe a white person, like this white person, let's say, has been in his past attacked by a black person and was mugged or beaten up. Now, the trauma of that experience drives like a Mack truck through that perceiving brain that's always scanning the environment for threats, which means that the bias toward there is a person with black skin in the room, therefore get that flight, fight, or freeze response ready. So that person, because of their trauma, is going to have their fast-thinking, scanning-the-room brain telling them something that it's going to be a lot harder to do work to talk themselves out of. Does this make sense? So part of what I'm saying is that because of the society in which we've grown up, and I feel like I can make that generalization. Because of the society in which we've grown up, we all have just a flood of racial bias that is coming up. Now, that doesn't mean that you believe, if you were to sit down and think about it, that two people are unequal simply because of their skin color or racial heritage. But that also doesn't mean that we should just deny that we have racial bias or racial thoughts at all, because pretending like we don't have those perceptions means we're never actually going to address them. We're just going to kind of live in denial, right? So when Charles and I talk, I just try to be honest with him about the things that I think. And we're at a place in our friendship where he calls me on stuff too. We were talking earlier this week, and I was asking him a question. I don't even remember what the question was, but I remember the first part of his response, because the first part of his response was, well, not that I can speak for all black people. And then there was like a short pause, and he said, but in my experience. And in that short pause was let me give you just a second to recognize what you just did, right? So I'm standing before you to be an expert in reconciliation, and I still act and ask questions because all black people are basically the same, one black person should be able to speak for everybody, right? And he picked it up and I didn't. And so he just, in Charles's way, not that I can speak for all black people, pause. You shouldn't have done that. But now we'll move on, right? So some of those things still need to be identified for us. I just wanted to talk about that because the insecurity piece, the fear piece, I think we can just calm down, right? Because we're supposed to be a confessing community. How do you get into Christian community? It's paradoxical. You are welcomed in when you confess the worst possible things about yourself. Everything about yourself that is shameful, that is sinful, that is harmful, that has been harmed, that has harmed other people. List that out, and those are the entry requirements. And then now you're in. But somehow once you're in, it's like confession becomes too dangerous. Like, you got in by confessing everything that was wrong with you. How do you not stay by continuing to confess everything that's wrong? So there's a sense in which I think we've got to really believe that it's okay. The second thing about that is the fear that being called racist, the fear that the burden of racism, the legacy of racism is going to be too much for us to bear, is too threatening to be attached to us. All you really have to do is get near the black church, because the black church has been bearing the legacy of racism for generations. So if you are afraid that the legacy of racism falling on your shoulders is going to be more than you can bear, then you need to hear the gospel preached in a black church so that you can know the liberating power, so that you can have the kind of confidence that will power you through this work. Does that make sense? Okay. Reconciliation we've defined as enemies and strangers becoming neighbors and friends. So it's not only enemies and hostility, it's enemies and strangers. So in Ephesians, where Paul reconciliation is the image of the gospel in the book of Ephesians. But in the book of Ephesians, estrangement and alienation from God and from one another is mentioned as the problem more often than hostility and enmity. Like, we go to that place where Christ has broken down the wall of hostility between us, but more often than not, Paul talks about how distant we are from God and one another, how alienated we are. And so the alienation and the distance, the fact that we are strangers to one another, is as much a problem to be solved through reconciliation as hostility. That has all kinds of reasons and other thoughts that we could go off into. And then one last thing before we get to how did we actually get to the place where we had these groups going, I swear. The one last thing is just to reinforce something from yesterday, which is interpersonal reconciliation, such as what happens in the peace meals, is incredibly important and incredibly powerful. I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't think that it were powerful. But it is also incredibly limited. You cannot do peace meals and assume that racism is going to be taken care of. It's not. So even if you want to use the language of reconciliation, right? Normally we go, well, reconciliation is a personal thing between God and me. And reconciliation on a horizontal level is sort of person to person. And we have an individual idea of what salvation is, an individual idea of what discipleship is, so an individual idea of what reconciliation is. But all you have to do is go to Colossians, where Paul talks about in him the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. All things were made by him and for him and through him, and in him all things hold together. And God was pleased in him to reconcile all things to himself. And you just have to go a little bit before that all things, because when you go, he wants to reconcile all things, then we imagine kind of a one-to-one individual reconciliation. But what it says right before that, because Paul defines all things just before that. All things, whether things in heaven or things on earth, whether thrones, dominions, or powers. So the reconciliation in Christ is not only a person-to-person reconciliation. The reconciliation in Christ is that God is bringing back every throne, every power, every empire to be reconciled back to the reign of Jesus. So peace meals is meant to act on that level of getting us to a place where we can uncover some of that bias, getting us to a place where we can let our walls down, getting us to a place where we can begin to form those genuine relationships, but it's not the whole journey. There's a systemic place. There's a structural place to work for reconciliation. So I need you to hear that at the beginning. I know like we haven't gotten to the how yet, but it's important to me that you know what the place of these peace meals is, that they really are powerful, that they can put pressure on the system, but it's not a place to do the full work. Does that make sense? Yeah.
When you use the pronoun we, are you talking about we white people or we white everybody?
Well, when I'm talking about what we can do to impact racism, then I'm talking about all of us. Yeah, I'm talking about white, black, everybody. For the most part, the we is white folks because, yeah, and mostly you can hear me speaking for myself. So if I say we, I mean, mostly I'm saying I, and I'm inviting you to come with me. So here's the thing about that. Do I speak for all white folks? So there's a danger in two different directions. So the danger in assuming that one black person can speak for all black people is to say that there is only one identity that's a black identity, and therefore everybody who's black has that same identity. And so we flatten the picture of the full humanity of the black person right in front of us. Now, on the other side, we say, well, white isn't even really a racial identity, right? It's just kind of like default. It's just kind of normal. And so in some ways, most white folks don't consider themselves to have a racial identity. So actually, in some ways, it is a corrective to say, well, white folks ... because white folks don't think of themselves as having a collective racial identity, even though we do. So on the one hand, to say, would you speak for all black people, continues an error that we make. But on the other hand, to say we white folks counteracts an error that we tend to make. Does that make sense? So I'm not saying that we need to speak to and treat everyone the same, because racism has caused racism has stolen ethnicity from white folks. I mean, you could read Lisa Sharon Harper and other people on that, that our ethnic identity has been suppressed in order to bring up kind of this power category of being white. Okay? All right. So we've talked about the limits. Peace meals is just one important piece. So how do we get there? So I want to give you the first 2 or 3 years of work that you need to do briefly. And then we'll show the video of a group actually running. And then while the video is going, I'll hand out the first discussion guide that we give to all the groups, and we'll go through that briefly, okay? So the work that we have to do to get there over a few years would be, first of all, to listen. As a good young white guy, I believe I can change the world. And I believe everybody knows that I can change the world. And this is an incredible temptation. So to get into a space and to listen, to learn the story, So we are appointed, and this has been reminded. I remember talking to Jerry Coates several years ago as I was trying to work out, what should the Alton mission be in Alton, and I was kind of struggling with some of the expectations of church members, and one of the things that he said to me, and was reinforced by Pastor Mark, has been reinforced by lots of other people, is you are appointed to work for the transformation of the community. You're not appointed to the church. You're not appointed to, a determinate number of people. You're not appointed to a campus. You're appointed to work for the transformation of the greater community. Now, that means that I go there. We believe in prevenient grace. God is already doing something. And the boundaries of the kingdom are not co-equal with the boundaries of the church. Hopefully, they overlap. But God is doing something in the lives and in the story of the place that we're called to. And so when it came to Alton, then it was learn the story of this place. And it was finding out that there's this checkered history in Alton with the connection to the civil rights movement. That we like to say we have Elijah Lovejoy, who was the first martyr of the Civil War, right? Because he was this abolitionist newspaperman. And so we claim Elijah Lovejoy, and we have the Elijah Lovejoy Monument, but we don't talk so much about how actually he only lived there for a few years, and he was killed by a mob of Altonians that was led by the guy who ended up getting elected mayor. And he's one of the longest serving mayors Alton has ever had. So who are we really? Or Lyman Trumbull, who is the senator who helped write the 13th Amendment. His house is a quarter of a mile from my house. He doesn't live there, I don't believe, anymore, although Alton is supposedly the most haunted city in America. So we go, oh, look at that piece of history, the U.S. senator who helped write the 13th Amendment. Well, he's also responsible for inserting the loophole that slavery shall be outlawed except as punishment for a crime. And do you know what southern states did with that? Southern states said, immediately when that loophole was in the 13th Amendment, they said, well, you now have to have papers proving that you are employed. And if you don't have papers proving that you are employed, you can be arrested and incarcerated. And once you're arrested and incarcerated, we can put you to work without paying you. So do you know what happened? Immediately after the 13th Amendment, there was a legal and economic incentive for businesses not to hire black folks, but instead have them arrested and then put to work for their businesses for free. And so it was fewer than 10 years after slavery ended that the state of Alabama was getting 60 to 70% of its revenue from convict leasing. I can get you that information. I mean, you could also go to the Legacy Museum, the Equal Justice Initiative in Birmingham, Alabama. Is it No, it's not Montgomery, Alabama. So you could go to EJI's website, but I can find you that. I've got that in notes somewhere. Sorry, that was off the top of my head. I need to go faster so we actually get to the why. I apologize. Huh?
That only is Southern practice.
Well, I mean, it's worked so well, it's been turned into a national practice with mass incarceration. But that's we probably shouldn't go down that, yeah. It is important, yeah. But primarily, yes, it was a Southern strategy, yeah, at first. Okay, so there's the listening to the story and deciding that you're going to push it in a redemptive direction. There's not tying your impact in the city that you've been called to simply to what you can get out of the city in terms of an increase in Sunday attendance, right? To be able to choose to do some things that are for the peace, the shalom, the benefit of the city, even if it doesn't mean Sunday attendance will increase. I've had people leave Alton Mission because they said, yeah, you have these personal projects, I guess, but, we're just kind of mad that if you had spent that time on church work, then maybe this would have grown more. And so we need to leave. Okay. Right, yeah. I mean, then we have a conversation about, well, what do you think a pastor is? What do you think the church is? I mean, all of that stuff that needs to be rehabilitated. Next, it's build alliances. which also means follow the lead of people like Charles, follow the lead of people of color, of people who have been historically marginalized. You know, Charles says, get off your high horse, and that place and that privilege and that position that's normally been reserved for white folks, let someone else occupy that. That's a difficult internal journey that I've had to, you know, because I'm like, if there's a high horse, I mean, I wouldn't mind being on it. I feel like I've been sort of groomed for that a little bit. So that's a tough journey. Then it's also practice these things yourself first. Practice these things first. And that's probably going to take most of the time before you're ready to kind of roll out peace meals in your community. So that's things like taking responsibility for your own learning, that don't just use the people of color in your life as Wikipedia. Like, you have Wikipedia. You have Google. I have most of the entire internet on my phone. Like, it's all there. I could connect to resources. I could learn from, go buy books by Lisa Sharon Harper. Go buy Roadmap to Reconciliation by Brenda Salter McNeil. That Roadmap to Reconciliation provides some of the foundation. We followed the roadmap in creating the Peace Meals journey. That arc of the 4 discussion guides follows the process that Brenda Salter McNeil outlines. Go listen to, if you go to podcasts, there's a Seeing White podcast that, especially for white folks, is really good. Now, I may need to warn you, he's a fairly liberal person. He's clearly a Democrat, so like trigger warning there, I guess. Just know that. But it goes through a lot of the history of how whiteness became a thing, how whiteness was invented, and the impact that it's had on our country. So take responsibility and initiative for your own learning, do the work, and then you'll be ready to lead other people into it. Now, that should take you, I don't know, maybe you've already been doing that. That was like years of work for me, and still is. That was years of going to things like the Martin Luther King Jr. commemoration service that the NAACP has put on for 35, 36 years in Alton. And when I went there the first time, probably 6, 7 years ago, when I was just in Alton, I was the only white person in the room who didn't have an official thing to do there up front, making a proclamation as the mayor, or saying something as a police chief, or whatever. And I'll tell you, it was really difficult. It was very difficult to be in that room, because part of that presentation, they had black children who just read some of the statistics of what they were going to face in life, about the school-to-prison pipeline, about inequities in education and wealth, the wealth gap between families of color and white families, and the violence that those children would face. And I was like, man, is it hot in here? Is it just me? Like, everybody else seems fine, but I am so, flushed. And I genuinely felt like running out of the room, because that sense of shame that was coming down on me, that sense of I need to escape this, that sense of there's got to be some other explanation, that sense of this can't really be true, that sense of grief. What if it is true? What am I doing here? Right? And deciding I'm not going to run, partly because that would draw more attention to me. But also, I need to sit, I need to feel this. So if you're going to do this work, the last thing that I'll say before we watch the video, if you're going to do this work, you've got to feel what you feel. And you've got to own what you think. And you've got to be okay where you are, acknowledging that. That's part of why Charles wanted to do that check-in yesterday. How much of you is present? No, I keep saying that wrong. He keeps laughing at me. It's not how much of you is present, because, you're entirely here. I don't think you've left any limbs out there. How present are you, I think, is the question. That's why he did it, not me. Are you emotionally present in this work? Or are you trying to turn off and ignore that deeper part of yourself and just operate on, well, I know that these are the right answers, so I'll just pretend like that's all that's happening inside of me? And are you giving people of color especially the permission to show up in your world fully themselves as well? Or can you only be in relationship with a black person who's never angry, who's never grieved, who's never bothered? Because someone being angry is the proper response often. The fact that we aren't angry, the fact that we don't feel, like, that's leprosy. Like, that needs to be healed. So Paul says our consciences have been seared, right, by these continual sins. I mean, we're born with seared consciences often as white folks. And why? Because we don't want to feel it. Now, God is gracious. He allows us to grow and to soften over time. If he ripped those calluses off and we were to feel it all at once, it might be too much. But God will be with you. Okay, let's watch this video so you can actually see a peace meal in action. Then I'll hand this out as we go, and we'll say a couple more things. And if you have questions, continue to interrupt me.
So are we moving backwards? Are we getting worse?
Yeah.
I think so. I think a lot of people are talking, a lot of people are protesting. I don't think many people are listening.
If I validate your experience, that means my experience is broken and wrong. No, it doesn't. It just means that I had a different experience.
My fear is being offensive. You know, I don't know if it's appropriate to ask this question, but if I don't, how will I ever know?
What these type of conversations, even in my own house with my own son, because he likes to preach to
Y'all
you.
are hard.
And I stick my foot in my mouth all the time, but I do it with white people equally as I do with black people, so it's okay.
I can vouch for that.
He tried to explain to me, the one black person in the office, that there was a time that slavery was, economically beneficial. And I need you to stop talking right now. And I just told him, I said, B, we're good. I just need you to stop talking, and I need to leave the room for just a minute.
But if he hadn't awkwardly made that faux pas, hopefully the next time he talks to a person of color,
That's true.
they have a better conversation.
And I remember pushing back so hard against the professor because every time he tried to tell the story of what it's like to be a person of color in our country, I just wanted to say that I was the same. And like, I had a hard upbringing, I had all these different things, so I pushed back all the time and wanted to say, well, no.
This white couple used to take my children to Sunday school, Bible study, every week when they had revival. And this what really got me. They came home from revival one night and they like, we getting baptized, all three of them. And I'm like, I'm gonna see what these white people doing. We fixed dinner, you would have thought we was a family. They learned soul food, we learned Italian food, and we were like one big happy family.
I really would not have fit in well in this society now. With bullying, with, the racism that still persists. I mean, I feel like, honestly, I would have been a person that would have been susceptible to, depression or suicide.
I feel like the easiest way to get people around the table is to say, what are our similarities? But the first thing that white people do is to say, yeah, right, it's similar. I don't know what all the fuss is about.
Gosh, we heal a lot. Just saying, we messed up.
We have sinned. We are sinning now. We have sinned, and our ancestors have sinned. We come from a long line of people who have gotten it wrong.
Yeah.
For me to be offering repentance, I'm sorry that it happened. I don't have to take that blame on me. I didn't do it.
The Fair Housing Act was placed so that people like me can go and rent an apartment anywhere I want to. Yet in Alton, a year ago when we looked at a place, the reason we live in Grafton is because everywhere I called, when I said, my name is Javier, would you please call me back, I'm interested in your place, I would not receive a phone call. I would have to have my wife call, and she would say,
Hi, this is Christy.
This is Christy, will you call me back?
Sure.
And not even a minute would go by, and she'd get a phone call. We still don't have access to this fair.
To me, this is where he's coming from. Why would I be punished or disliked because of something my ancestors did? You know, and to be, like I said, to me, it's just like you cannot be held accountable for other people's actions.
That's the kind of stuff that I experienced in the last 5 years, like recently in this area, constantly. So for me, I think racism is worse here than it is in the South. Because in the South, you know I have a Confederate flag. Please understand that you're not welcome here. Here, there's glass ceilings, there's glass walls to keep you in your place, but make you feel like you can go someplace or can achieve something else.
The idea of just a sit-down open discussion is a real rarity. I mean, I've loved being together with you guys. And
Yeah.
This was nice.
It's new
I'm
friends.
glad
I know, I like it.
I came. I'm glad I came.
But outside of this, what does this look like? Making it bigger.
One of my friends is a therapist, and he said, like, you can't let something go unless you hold it. Like, we always say, let it go, but you can't, you have to pick it up. So, I don't know, we gotta pick it up. We gotta be able to touch it and hold it as long as we need to.
Take a deep breath, say a little prayer, and jump. Just don't miss out on any experience because of fear. Take the plunge, it's worth it.
Where do we go from here? Where do we go? And is it free or just?
I've got like 50 copies, so if you want to take more copies of this, it's the first discussion guide for the first meeting. So here's how we actually implemented this, okay? Now, please understand that if we spent an hour yesterday on the why, and we spent most of, probably a half hour, 30 minutes this morning on sort of the personal journey to get to the place where we can effectively lead this sort of thing, it means that is most of the work. All right? Once you do that work, doing this is not that hard. Doing this is, I've already built the alliances and the coalitions, I've already listened, I'm already doing some of the work, I've already had some of this experience. So it's just finding a way, which there's a lot of intelligence for this in the room, finding a way to lead other people through it. Okay? So what we did was we ran piecemeals in a much simpler discussion guide with pastoral leaders in Alton through the alliance that we had built for a few years to work on issues of reconciliation. So we leveraged what we were building there to try and get some leaders to go through the experience. And there were a couple of groups that actually did it. And I will tell you, Pastor Mark has been one of the people who has been a constant presence in doing this work. Pastor Chris Smith has been one of the people when I talked about the community feast. I mean, he did so much of the behind-the-scenes work. So this is not just like me coming and saying, look at the work that I've done. I mean, your other Free Methodist leaders, Pastor Pat has been a part of it, is going through Peace Meals right now with a group. So like this is a very Free Methodist, like there's more oomph behind it than just me. More people from the Alton Emmanuel Church and stuff like that, okay? So don't look at me like whatever, okay. So we did that to try and get the leaders to go through it and experience it themselves. And then we had Charles's church, Unity Fellowship, and my church, Alton Mission, begin to get together to worship together. We've done that about 5 or 6 times. and they're gonna come to our place on the 28th, the week after Easter. So that'll be the next time that we do worship together. And then out of that, because what we wanted to do, we found that there's a lot of hesitancy and there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of we don't know what the experience is going to be like. So what Charles and I wanted to do was take two churches and have worship be the platform for we're getting used to each other. We see some familiar faces. Some of that anxiety goes down. It's in a little bit more of a controlled space, right, where there's leadership from up front, so we get used to one another. We get used to being around each other. And then from there, take the step to try to get people into the piecemeal groups. Now, in your community, to get people to actually sit down around the table may take intermediate steps kind of like that. It may take a bit for people to get to the place where they're ready to do that. And that was true, if we're talking about who's the we. That was perhaps more true for Charles's church than for my church. He had to have some discussions with some of his church. I believe the phrase "you're acting like bougie white people" was perhaps used at some point there. So just know that leaders in the black community and the black church are doing their work. And sometimes we go, well, why do white people always get yelled at? Well, what about, it's like our job is not, like, I'm not a politician. I don't pander. I don't tell you what they need to hear and tell them what you need. I tell you what you need to hear, what we need to hear to change, right? Isn't this like basic pastoring? You're trying to mediate a conflict, or basic parenting. Like, I'm not going to tell you what your brother needs to do different. I'm going to tell you what, the choices, okay, whatever, sorry. Then we create these session guides. So once we get people comfortable enough to show up for dinner in one another's homes, then the session guides take us on a bit of an arc. So the first step you have in front of you, the first step is identification, finding what we have in common. So as many similar experiences, as many similar kinds of things about us as possible, we want to find. As many connections in our stories. We want people after the first session to get a sense that we're in this together. There's a new we that is forming, that it's not us and them. That's the primary purpose here. So in that identification, that's an incredibly important first step. We don't say, let's get together, fine, everybody show up in one another's homes, now discuss mass incarceration. Like, people are not prepared to do that. They're not prepared to risk that with one another, right? So identification is the first step. You see on the back a group covenant. And what we say is, you've got to be, as a group, there's a lot of autonomy, right? So we say, look, you can choose a leader who's going to take you through from among the people who have been assigned in your group, or what's probably better is you all take responsibility for one another. And so you all lead and you all follow. You all serve and you are all served. But this covenant, we say, these are some of the basic commitments. And if you're not up for these basic commitments, then this is probably not for you. Now, that's not to avoid conflict. All right, this is not to avoid conflict. This is not to keep conflict from happening, because oftentimes what happens is we say there's not outright hostility, therefore everything must be fine. And we forget, wisdom all throughout the tradition dealing with racism, right? Dr. King talking about negative peace versus positive peace. Negative peace being the absence of conflict. And sort of there's security and there's calm. And oftentimes that's enough, but there's not the presence of genuine love and harmony and justice. So we're not avoiding conflict. Part of the reason why we don't fight in Alton, right? Part of the reason why white pastors and black pastors don't have a lot of hostility between each other is because we don't have much contact with each other. So the lack of conflict is actually a sign of our alienation from each other. So This covenant is not to say, let's not have fights, let's not have disagreements, let's not get emotional. The covenant is to say you have to have a basic commitment to one another, a basic commitment not to do harm, a basic commitment to the journey. Like, you are here to make peace. It's going to take us through some moments of higher energy and conflict and emotion, and that's okay. And if your group needs help, then we have several people who are key leaders in the community who've been identified to be the people who can go in and mediate if a group gets stuck, right? To go in and help bring that group toward peace. We're not telling people to avoid conflict. We're not telling people don't feel what you feel, okay? Does that make sense? So, in particular, I wanted to give you this first one so you could see this is the basic structure of all 4 discussion guides, but I only wanted to give you the first one because this is what we do to the groups as well. Take the step in front of you, right? Don't jump ahead. Have you taken the step in front of you? Okay, when you're ready to take the next step, we'll send you discussion guide number 2. Also, this gives us time to write discussion guide number 2. Yeah.
So do you find that you actually accomplish this in one meal, or does this take several meals just to get through the first step?
So what we try to tell people is use this discussion guide as a platform for meeting one another, right? So the first time through, we had a discussion guide that was incredibly sparse because it was like, we don't want the paper in between people. But there wasn't enough there for people to really go deep. So now there's more structure here, but now we have to really major on telling people these bullet points are not check boxes that you have to, check all these off before you go to the next, just see where the group is. Use this as a platform. But for the most part, yeah, people meet for 3 hours, 3.5 hours, and then they go, we didn't even get all the way through it. And that's fine. It doesn't need to be gotten all the way through if the purpose has been achieved, okay? So the second guide, I'll just tell you what the other 3 steps are. So the first one is identification. What do we have in common? The second is experience is kind of the key word there. So what's your identity, your heritage, the culture that you come from? So we begin to learn about difference. We start with commonality, then we begin to learn about difference in a safe way. So what do you do around holidays? What do you do with family? What do you enjoy? We start to explore racial identity, right? How are you often described? How do you prefer to be described? And that's an important question. That's an important question. Like, and different friends will give you different responses. So if you're looking for that, I just want a black person to tell me what I should call black people. I mean African Americans. I mean people of African. I don't know. Just I need one person to tell me how to treat everyone. Like, that's not going to happen. Okay. But it's an important conversation to have, right? So commonality, then difference. Now the third one is on perspective. And the third one combines the skills from the first 2, right? So we've learned to listen empathetically. We've learned about commonality. We've learned about difference. Now we're putting those 2 things together. How have we had different experiences within the same society? So we know about sameness. We know about difference. And now we put that together in a more complicated picture of the society that we're living in. We're living in the same culture. And yet we have very different perspectives, very different experiences. How is it that our perception and our treatment within the same culture can be so different? Now, do you understand why it's important that comes at like step 3? That there's got to be some trust built. There has to be some skills in empathetic listening built, right? There has to be some courage to come out and be okay with difference in the room. And then the 4th session is taking action. Now that we know what we know, now that we've heard what we've heard, now that we're connected like we are, what do we do? So the 4th one isn't meant to be the end of the experience. The 4th one is meant to be decide for yourselves that this is going to be a springboard to whatever the next step is. And then we want to kind of come in and say, here's some suggestions about next steps, right? You've done the interpersonal reconciliation piece. You've done the empathetic listening. You've uncovered some of your biases. You've formed some new relationships that will guide you. You've begun to do the work. Well, now what do you need to do? What do you need to learn? Who do you need to stay connected to? And so we'll see. This group that you've heard, seen some stuff from them is a collection of Alton Mission and Unity Fellowship folks. So they went through the whole thing once, and then they said, okay, what do we do now? And I said, well, did you do the thing where you got together and you decided what action you were going to take? No. Okay, well then you didn't actually do what we, so get together, so they're actually going through it again. The idea is not to just send people through the piecemeal experience over and over and over. It's meant to springboard toward being an ambassador of reconciliation in your life. It's meant to go, okay, now that I've had that interpersonal experience, now how do I use everything that I have at my disposal, whether that's the roles I have in community, power, privilege that I have, to work for reconciliation on a larger scale, okay? Thoughts or questions? We've got like a little over 20 minutes before we have to be in there, so yeah.
According to Mission Insight, my community is 99 point percentage Caucasian. I can think of maybe 3 people in our community that are of different culture or when she was talking about Confederate flags hanging outside off the porches, I see that in my community.
Yeah.
What would be a good place to start with? One of those individuals lives at my house. My daughter is biracial. So what would be a good starting point? Because I think this concept is awesome, but where do you start if you're in a community that is 99.blank%?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily choose piecemeals as what you're going to do. In the work that you would do leading up to what kind of action should we take, because if it's 99 point whatever %, then to have the handful of people of color be like that's going to feed into what we do to kind of squash the identity of people of color. So this probably isn't going to be the thing for you at all, but that doesn't mean that there isn't work that could be done. I mean, I think about B.T. Roberts and the other founders of the Free Methodist Church who said we need to take an abolitionist stance. And I mean, I've been a member of the Free Methodist Church nearly as long as I've been a pastor in the Free Methodist Church. I was hired by Emmanuel, and then Pastor Mark said, you should probably become a member. And I was like, well, let's see how it goes for a little while first. But they were in New York, right? So they could have easily said, well, we don't struggle with slavery here, so it might not be our issue, right? Right. So, but there are going to be important ways to do the work. I mean, off the top of my head, I don't know what those ways might be. But to find maybe a piecemeal's experience that would be, because this would be really useful, and I've heard from a lot of leaders of color, like, you just need to get white people in the room together so that they can have this conversation, so that we don't have to continue to be the source, because that's exhausting, right? So that when we talk about like mass incarceration, then white folks need to be up on that conversation and those sources, so that it's not always, a leader of color comes into the room and they say mass incarceration. We haven't heard about that. So can you give us something to read? Can you back up with statistics? And so what we constantly do, and again, we're speaking in generalizations, we expect people of color to validate and prove their experience before we receive it as legitimate and, in some sense, authoritative in our lives. So there's still probably a place to do something kind of like this, to be able to have the conversation among white folks. But I just haven't done a lot of thinking about how to design that. Yeah. Yes?
I think you're right on point. It gives me a lot of hope to see a white person leading this conversation. Yes. Because it's like adding insult to injury for me to educate white folks about the experiences of minorities in this country. I am very lucky. I grew up in a majority culture in Southern Texas where everybody looked like me. But I grew up with a conscience. When I came to Northeast, when I became a minority, I don't have to be dependent on any white person to give me my sense of worth or being. I'm happy to be married to a wonderful white person. But I don't have to depend on white people to give me a conscience. I have one. Yeah. But it is refreshing, but it is exhausting. And a Hispanic woman who got me as white, sometimes I have to represent multiple groups. Right. I have to represent my people from Southern Texas, border people. I have to represent all minorities. I have to represent all Hispanics from all of Latin America and all international people because I grew up in two cultures, two languages, and it is exhausting, yeah, because I'm the one that can see the other side of the story.
Thank you for that. Other thoughts or questions? Yes.
So I assume that within each of these piecemeal groupings, that there's a designated leader or team.
There isn't. Now, I mean, we're still experimenting a little bit. So what we've tried to do is to say because we want everyone to be fully present, and because we want everyone to take responsibility for what's happening in the room, then we're not going to identify leaders for you. So if naturally people take, and what we've seen is people kind of take different roles. So from the outside, you could gently, like if a group is having trouble getting momentum, you could say, well, why don't you just have one person who helps coordinate, meal and childcare and stuff like that. So it's not all on the person who's hosting. Or if someone's better at leading discussion, then let them lead discussion. But it's really important because your process leader has to give up some of the freedom to be a full participant in the discussion. And a lot of times what happens is I want to take charge of leading the conversation because, this is what's happening right now. I'm in charge of the conversation because I have some points to make, right? This would not be a good model for piecemeals, all right? So part of what we've done is try to allow some of those things to happen naturally with coaching to kind of come alongside, or if a group gets stuck, to be able to have someone who's ready to come and mediate, help them through conflict. It may, so far we haven't had anything but a little bit of confusion, like, well, what are we supposed to do? And part of that, honestly, just reveals that in the church we don't empower lay people too much, because mostly right now it's still church folks showing up to these, and they're going, well, did your pastor tell you? No. Did your pastor tell you what? No. So who is in charge? Somebody call the pastor right now, like.
Well, just get some of the skills that you're taught, activist,
Yeah.
empathetic, whatever.
Right.
Not everybody gets that. And so if you're in a room where that particular skill isn't in place, or at least has been taught to somebody, then it can get really messy.
Right.
That's true. That is true. So it's this fine balance of we keep the piecemeals, especially the guide on the front side, as easy at a glance as possible, and then on the back we'll have sort of more information that you don't have to go through but will support. And then we have a Facebook page that we try to push out additional content. So if there's a podcast, if there's resources, if there's some kind of, the ADL put together a really great guide that could be printed off on how to have things like this go well. So we put that on the Facebook page and email that to people. So we try to get all the resources there for them, be ready to come alongside the groups to make sure they're accessing those and that things are still going pretty well. But the risk is, you're not in the room to make sure it works. But if reconciliation is going to be a thing, it's going to have to be a thing that isn't like coerced and forced from somebody who has a microphone is in charge and doesn't listen. Yes, Peter.
Your comment, I think, really strikes home for me. Because you're asking about empathetic listening, and we hear that this requires courage, and we recognize it also takes radical humility. It takes a posture of confession. And so basically, in order to do this work, we just have to be Christian. So, I mean, that's the thing, right? Like so what does this mean for our churches? What does this mean for us? For the kinds of character and tempers and postures towards one another, a desire for love, even through the mess. What does it require of us? Like, this sounds crazy hard. And the reason why it sounds crazy hard is really because we haven't submitted ourselves to the kind of conversion that God wants for us all. Like, this is going to require everything we have. And maybe it gives me, as a pastor, a kind of, I don't know, kind of like maybe a roadmap for the kinds of tempers and virtues I want to form myself and my children and my churches.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dr. King, when you talked about the mass meetings that they would have in Birmingham when they were doing the bus boycott for over a year, he said that the mass meetings accomplished on Monday and Thursday nights what the church had failed to do on Sunday. So he's identifying, as a person who was a part of that failure in a way, that we have it's incredible the kind of platform for influence, for social change, as well as for personal transformation we have. I mean, there aren't really other places that somebody, like, every week gets to stand up and pour into people, into their lives, right? To design an experience. Like, people don't do that. They do that with their media, right? That they consume. So this is pretty incredible. So yeah, to be able to say, what kind of people are necessary in Greenville? What kind of people are necessary in Cowden? What kind of people do we need to have in Glen Carbon and Edwardsville who are prepared to be a part of the story of redemption that God is writing? Well, let's prepare them every Sunday. And not simply go, well, I don't know, what was Andy Stanley preaching on? That seemed pretty good. I mean, maybe that would work. That's a cute, right? Yeah. I mean, nothing against Andy. Well, maybe a little against Andy Stanley.
I think a lot of times, for me, I'm thinking of just color, racism within culture. And in actuality, there's a lot more going on as far as with people that are welfare versus those that are educated. There's so many other types of differences of racism.
Yeah.
For other than just color, religion. And I know for me, I have to expand my brain, to look beyond the colors to see that there are a lot of differences out there.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which to be able to have reconciliation across lines of difference, the same kind of structure of this. I mean, you could still use Brenda Salter McNeil's book, Roadmap to Reconciliation, for trying to reconcile Democrats and Republicans in your church, right? So, like, across lines of difference, you could still do this work. In part, I'm just trying to allow the story of Alton to impact, because people are, well, why'd you choose just white and black? Well, partly because we still need it, but partly because, yes? No, that's all right. You should have raised your hand sooner, probably. Let's be honest. Yes?
Did all groups go as smoothly as that one seems to go, or did you ever have situations where some people might be resistant to what they were doing?
Yeah, I mean, so even that group has hit some speed bumps. All right, even this second time through. I didn't put in there one person saying, because somebody mentioned the word reparations. It was just brought up, right? It wasn't even like I'm gonna talk about how I believe in this. So the word reparations was mentioned, and one of the white folks said, reparations? I'll leave the country before I pay reparations. And the two black ladies, Monique and Rhonda, actually, Miss Dolores, the older black lady, that is Charles's mom. Oh, did he tell you that? Yeah. Which is fun. So she has some fun stuff to say about, oh, my son, whatever. So she doesn't believe all the same things, and she sort of rolls her eyes at her son, pushing her. But so the Monique and Rhonda, in that moment, kind of look at each other and are like, okay. So there's part of what you're still seeing is a lot of code switching. So code switching is since we're in a common space, it is by default white space. This is not black space where we speak in the way black people would speak to each other, and that also means that we have to edit not just what we say, but what we feel and how we emote, and even the kinds of things that we can talk about. And so there was this look between them that said, okay, this is a dangerous subject, and clearly we're not going to go there. So yeah, there's still moments like that. Now, I was in the room filming things, so they constantly were trying to get me to be a part of it. And so, like, on that one, I was just trying to stay, like, just don't make eye contact with anybody, just kind of see what's happening in the room, that sort of thing. But yeah, there have been those moments even in that very meal that we filmed, yeah. Any last comments? Thanks for being so gracious. If you have other thoughts or questions, connect with me, let's talk, and get out of here. I mean, God bless you as you go.